All right, folks, you are listening to or watching our review of She-Hulk Attorney at Law Season 1, Episode 7, The Retreat. I'm Dan Gavosden, filling in for David Chen, and he's Siddhant Adlaka. Hello, Siddhant Adlaka. Hello again. Let's
Hello,
get
Dan
into
Gavosden.
our review proper of She-Hulk Episode 7, The Retreat. Why don't you start us off here, Siddhant? What'd you think of this episode? You have this history with the show, talking about episodes 1 through 6. Where does this one sit for you?
Like most of the show, I think it's fine. It's fun in parts, mostly inoffensive. I think, I feel like I'm just repeating myself every week when it comes to this specific segment, because it's like there's not much of a variation in quality from episode to episode, just because there's not much variation in what the episodes try and do, whether it's structurally or story-wise or even, visually or in terms of its sense of humor. This one has its fun moments. It has the moments that really stick out to me as a filmmaker when it skillfully avoids and edits around the actual transformations because they don't want to show how poorly those were done. But, overall, I think it's a fun one. I think it comes the closest to doing what we said the Dan Slott comic does, which is what we talked about in the first half of this episode. And that is, fleshing out this world and showing how populated it really is with, superheroes and like superpowered characters.
Yeah, my favorite episode of the show so far was episode 4, mostly maybe because of Madison, but I like the kind of like setup of the kind of lawyerly conceit there. I think it asked an interesting question of the MCU, like, can you trademark the concept of magic as it exists as a real thing? Like, that's an interesting parallel to our real world where magic is not real. And I like seeing that update. But like I said earlier, I think the episodes that outside of that particular episode, the stuff that resonates the most to me is when this show has fun with kind of like the idea of like dating as a woman in your early 30s, and kind of like what it means to wrestle with celebrity and having kind of like a public persona and a private persona, mostly because I don't, as much as this show wants to claim that it's a lawyer show, I think it's very disinterested in actually showing us like any kind of like casework. I guess the past 2 episodes we haven't really had She-Hulk involved in any legalese, right? Last episode they shoehorned in the Mr. Immortal stuff. And I don't know that I miss it all that much. Yeah. When she has gotten involved in a case, I feel like she's gotten out on a technicality rather than any kind of like smart intuition on her behalf, whether it be Wong showing up or her just happening to know some guy well in a personal life that she can testify in their own case. And I don't really feel like I know much about GLK&H, like as an entity. Is it a successful firm? What's her place in it? Is there jostling for positions? Is she being held to any kind of standard? I don't know that the show is interested in that stuff. So I kind of like these diversions, frankly. And it allows kind of like Tatiana Maslany to do some great things and deliver monologues. And I think the ones she's delivered about being a woman in various scenarios have been both, appropriate to the story and light enough to fit in with a comic book thing. And so this one was one of the better ones to me, just because I felt like I understood the stakes and really could spend time with characters and maybe have a little laugh here and there. Do you want to push back on any of my assertions of this, or?
No, not at all. It didn't actually strike me until you mentioned it that there was actually no B plot this week. There was no real lawyer stuff. The only like lawyer type of thing that happens is what gets her to the retreat. The thing that,
Yeah.
oh, then, he may have violated his parole, so let's get her there. Oh, he hasn't. Okay. So it again, it's just kind of sort of there in the background as like, this is the one episode where her having, her being a lawyer has nothing to do with anything pretty much. And yeah, I didn't miss it. So you're right about that.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention is this episode was written by Zeb Wells, who is a comic writer. He's currently writing Amazing Spider-Man, which I'm covering on my show, Amazing Spider Talk. But the interesting thing about Zeb, well, there's many interesting things about Zeb, but one of the interesting things is that he's married to Heidi Gardner from SNL. And I actually think that there's like an interesting kind of thread in this work about like a woman with a kind of like public persona that's seen as larger than life and maybe the perfect one versus the private persona that you kind of wish you could be. And I wonder if like being in a relationship with like a famous person, TV celebrity, found its way into the writing. Because I found like the latter half of this episode's discussion of that like genuinely moving, despite I think not knowing very much about Jen Walters and her desires as a human being. We never saw her really much pre-Hulk. And this show kind of like begs us to desire for her to get back to that without having really seen it. But there was some authenticity lended by the writing and Tatiana Maslany's performance that I think enriched this episode more than the standard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and usually Marvel tends to have an over-reliance on exposition and scenes that are delivered through dialogue. But I thought there was this one great scene where she's sitting in that little support group at the retreat, talking about how how in high school there's that one friend who's more athletic, more attractive. People want her more. What if you could become that person? I'm like, this is a really interesting sort of schism in identity that I kind of wish the show touched on more. But I think, 7 out of 9 episodes in, I think that's probably like the most we're really going to get. But you're right. It was a well-delivered monologue. It was, the way the actual physical design of She-Hulk is rendered, unfortunately, takes away from the real performance a little bit. But, how many times can I say that? It's like a continued problem. But again, Tatiana Maslany is proving week after week that when the camera is on her as like a real living, breathing human being, she does some great work. There are like really small moments that I think, maybe some other performers might have treated as insignificant, like when she's sitting around watching TV and waiting for a text. It isn't just like, all right, let me check my phone. The phantom vibrations of the phone are the most important thing in the world to her. And really, who among us, like who has not experienced that? Like, why aren't they texting me back? I like that as like the setup for an episode.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's actually a great bridge into the episode itself, which is to say this episode starts with a sequence like that seems almost straight out of a comic book. It's a montage, right? It's a series of very specifically chosen images to convey, an impression of a larger meaning, which is her kind of, both dating and then kind of lovesick, waiting for a response from our good man Josh, who we met last episode. What did you think of this opening sequence? It definitely stood out to me.
Yeah, I thought it was effective simply because, I think Josh is charming. Like from the moment he showed up last week, I thought, all right, this guy he seems goofy, down to earth, flirtatious, respectful, seems like, to put it very reductively, he seems like a very fit and well-built nerd. Like, I know that's reductive, but I think that's the vibe they're going for. Like, all right, he's not like some, dumb meathead. He has his own like anxieties, but, there's something really attractive about him as well. So, of course, it's going to be, disappointing when he behaves the way he does and doesn't, call or text her back. I do wish on some level that that is all that we were dealing with him, just to give her something, more realistic dating wise, to be up against. But at the end of it, it's just a reveal that happens way at the end that he was after her blood. So as far as she knows, she was ghosted by a guy who she thought was much nicer than he turned out to be. Where it goes from here is anybody's guess, but I think the reason that quote unquote betrayal stings as much as it does is because there's a sort of effervescent quality to that opening montage. The show is not concerned with action or CGI in those moments. It's just about creating a feeling. It's not even about conveying a scene or a plot. It's just about like, all right, this is the mood that we're in. This is the mood that Jen is in. And then as soon as you're out of that mood, it's like, oh, that's a bit of a downer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in isolation, this montage is very effective. There's a lot of parts of it that like I think are undermined by the series history. Like Josh ghosting her, he's not even the first guy in this show to do as much, right? We just a few episodes ago got a guy that slept with her and then in the morning ghosted her for the opposite reason, I guess, than Josh. And I think that takes a little bit of the sting out of it, which is to say, like, I don't really know where Jen's headspace is at the start of this episode. And this show is not Seinfeld, right? It's not like like Seinfeld might as well, for most of Seinfeld, it's not interested in ongoing storylines. And so like each episode can be viewed in isolation. But the fact that the show is interested in stringing along these ongoing plots makes you want to read the emotional highs and lows of these characters. And I don't think the show gives us enough to really feel that, or it's repeating beats fairly regularly that these things don't really land. A good example of this is in one of the scenes in the montage where Jen wins Female Lawyer of the Year, which is meant to be like a joke that she's not caring about that. She gets this big, acclaim, that would apparently mean a lot to her, but she's too busy waiting for Josh to text her back, like the phantom text, as you put it. But there's no context for what that means. Like, we've not really seen her struggle or what her competition was like, or that she really wants something like that, much less many courtroom scenes with her. So that win doesn't mean anything, that it's thrown away other than in title only. And that's where I feel like this show is trying to kind of like have its cake and eat it too. And maybe it's a product of like a very crowded writer's room. But again, I thought it worked in this episode, but in the context of the show itself, I think it ends up undermining like how emotionally potent these scenes can be.
Yeah, and on that note, it's kind of crazy that, again, stuff happens episodically. Each episode is its own fun little adventure, but there is like an overarching plot as well. And again, we're 7 episodes in, and I still couldn't really tell you what that overarching plot is. Like, what's going on with this, whoever this Hulk King is, what do these people want? These are questions that would be intriguing like 3 or 4 episodes in. Now it's like, okay, I guess something else is happening. There's like less than 60 minutes of this show left. I'm assuming we'll see something more to do with this, but even if we don't, it's like so far it hasn't really mattered. So
well, it feels like it's just going to be like another throwaway, like some of the other things that we get. So why invest so much in the suspense of this?
Yeah. And so, which is why it's like also, why have Josh be a part of that at all if it's going to be a throwaway? Well, we don't know for sure that it will be, but given the show's track record, you're right. It feels like it may as well just be a throwaway.
And yet, sometimes these characters seem to come back. I was not expecting Blonsky to show up again in the show, and yet here he is. Jen gets a call from his parole officer that he may be turning into Abomination and breaking free of his, court-mandated, I guess, retreat, if you will. which seems like, I mean, look, if you're going to be stuck somewhere, like he seems to have made it work to his favor. But of course, it's just a tech error, and her car, gets, like kind of into this cell-free surface. I did like the note that she's kind of like can't stop checking her phone while she's driving. Like that actually hit for a laugh for me during this whole sequence. That and the bop to break the emotional tone. So we show up at the retreat. Blonsky's fine, and then we get the introduction of our first of like true F-list Marvel characters, barging their way in. And look, I am a sucker for F-list Marvel characters. Sign me up for them. One of my favorite comic runs of recent years is Superior Foes of Spider-Man, which was like an F-list book from beginning to end. We get Manbull and El Aquila here, who I got to admit, even I don't even really know much about their comic history. Are these characters that you're familiar with?
Not Manbull. I can't even really say I'm too familiar with El Aquila, other than like I know he's a mutant. So that's a fun little tidbit there. It's fun that She-Hulk can just introduce casually a character that in the comics is a mutant and does what they do as a mutant. Like that bioelectricity thing, like that's his thing in the comic, and it's treated so casually here, and I kind of love that. There's no gravity to it. Granted, they don't like say he's a mutant or anything, but I kind of wish they may have I kind of wish they'd have played like the X-Men animated theme or something. It seems like
move
the kind
side Wolverine. We got El Aquila. Yeah. I loved the kind of like repeated beat that they have here that he's not actually a matador. And like that, like Manbull seems to have a real issue with this, but at the same time, they're like have this almost bro love for each other because of this theming issue. That always made me laugh. Like to me, that was kind of one of the prime laughs of this episode.
The others are sort of interchangeable, but those two, they have a really fun dynamic, and I hope we get to see more of them. And it's so funny to see for the first time what Blonsky's method actually is over here. That all right, eventually you sit and talk about it, but you also like work out your aggression because you're superheroes and you have to like put that energy somewhere.
So of course they put that energy into her Prius Prime, which they're sure to name check a bunch of times. So I'm wondering how much we got an ad here for a Prius in this episode. But so of course that leaves Jen stranded at the retreat where we learn that there is a sauna lodge, and she eventually mysteriously finds her way to a shed, which I got a good laugh out of. On the wall it says Abomaste. And I can't even begin to unpack what they think that means in this universe. But of course it is a men's support group that she's walking into with Porcupine, Saracen, who is a guy that thinks he's a vampire. And I gotta say, I like squealed with glee because Porcupine is like a favorite villain of mine. He had a great appearance in a Spider-Woman run a few years ago, and he just kind of like prickled his way into my heart. So I was happy to see him here. This is kind of the key scene of the episode, and probably, the rest of the episode is just a setup to get to this scene and get to Jen's speech in this scene. What do you think of the construction of this men's therapy group?
I think, it's one of those very simple dramatic setups that's like, give Jen what she needs, even if it's not what she wants, because she needs to put her phone down, take a breath, and like introspect about why she's doing what she's doing, why she's focused on this guy to the point of, obsession. Well, not obsession, that's putting it a little harshly, but, she's, obsessed with like checking her phone to see if he's texted back, and, why she can't just let this go. And I think they find a really, entertaining way to do that, through these really goofy, characters. It's an emotional breakthrough for her that comes in like the most unserious way, and that to me is just, it encapsulates what the show is. If this was like a really intense, let's sit down and dig into your past trauma thing, I would probably be bored by it. Just because Marvel has tried to do things like that in the past, where it'll be like action, 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 and then let's talk for a second about what this action supposedly means, and then more action, action. But here it's just hey, it's fun. Everyone's got their own weird baggage, whether it's a cultural identity crisis, or you are a bull-faced lab experiment, or you can't, yeah. Or you can't seem to leave your porcupine suit because you see it as like an emotional armor. Which I thought, these fun little, surface level things that they don't really need to go into detail with, because they all sort of inform Jen's journey in a way that maybe I would have liked to see more, because, with Man Bull, it's all about like, I look a certain way. With El Aguila, it's like, well, this is how people perceive me, but my identity is something else. And with the porcupine, it's like, all right, I'm shielding my, emotions from other people. And these are all things that, She-Hulk has sort of been through. So I would have liked to have seen those reflections of her play in a little more. Saracen, I don't know. I think he's just there for the joke of like, oh, Josh is after your blood.
Well, if you really want to go deep, Saracen is all about taking in the blood of others, just as She-Hulk did in the first episode.
Oh, okay. Well done.
I'm just pulling that directly out of my ass, so don't give it too much credit, but okay.
Yeah, so there is something there, whether or not it's like, super deep, I guess.
Fair enough. I thought that joke was funny because it is so obvious that he was there for her blood. Especially in hindsight. Wrecker does kind of come way into. We do get a little bit of an action sequence at some point. I actually thought like there's something interesting about like her choosing to open up and share even with him there, and that she can subside her rage and understand that he was hired for this job, and she can like contextualize that. But it also goes to that whole thing with like the Hulk King or whatever that plot line is, which is to say like they kind of were very quick to just kind of throw away the Wrecker's involvement in that, which is only to say I don't expect that plot line to really have that much value if they're willing to like the one guy they've set up being a part of it, they're ready to just abandon it too. Although I have my theories that they might use this to introduce the leader, into the MCU on the back of this show, just like they did with Kang. But it's a whole other topic for another day and another episode of this show.
The leader is like an 8chan mod.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, he's really Q. Is what we're getting at here.
Oh God, Hulk King is Q confirmed. Yes. The Wrecker thing I thought was funny, both because she like sort of triggers this previously on, which I thought was fun because no one's gonna remember that guy. And I thought like for a second with the footage they used, I thought, wait, was this guy not in the original scene and they just like sort of inserted him in there or used some like additional take or something? And no, like that guy is in there hopping around in the background and we just didn't notice him the first time. I went back and watched it. Like the only difference is like I think the shot they use of him like, dancing or whatever in the background lasts maybe like half a second longer. So your eyes can like focus on him. But no, good callback, I guess, to something that none of us really absorbed.
Yeah. So we talked lightly about like Jen's, monologue / speech here. And the idea that like she feels turning into She-Hulk is like a form of cheating. This kind of like well-crafted persona. I'm curious, Siddhant, if we're both online people, and I think your work is kind of more, more widely published than myself. Do you have any connection to this kind of separation from like what your writing presents and who you are on the internet?
I would say none that I consciously made while watching She-Hulk, but now that you
Yeah.
ask me, just to some degree, because I guess being online is all about how you present yourself, and you do have a little more control. You have essentially a way of editing yourself in the way you come across. You have control over it. Some people take advantage of that control. Like my Twitter is just like, all right, let me a few jokes here and there. Let me just tweet about work. Like it's 4 or 5 years ago, it was this sort of unfiltered, unpleasant version of myself. I was like, oh, gotta discourse 24/7. But now it's like, no, let me just like let me put the filter on really hard. So I get that to an extent, like how there are two yous, as there always would be in any scenario. It's not just limited to like online. Your work self and your home self and who you are around your friends. So just in that very basic sense, She-Hulk, as in the character, does ask the question like, oh, at what point am I an imposter? Who is the authentic me? And it's again one of those things that I wish the show dedicated more time towards, because it's clearly asking the right questions. It's probably not going to use its drama or even its comedy to actually follow those instincts.
Yeah.
None of her her big dilemmas are really going to emanate from that schism in identity, beyond what they have already, which is like, oh, this guy likes She-Hulk, this guy likes Jen, but I'm kind of both of them, so what's my dating life like? So unless the last two episodes like pivot very hard towards just focusing in on that, I think it's going to be more window dressing than anything. But like I keep saying, in a more serious show, that would be very unpleasant to watch. But again, it's this one's sort of farcical, so it's like, yeah, okay, I guess this is what She-Hulk is about now. Let's watch a 20-minute sitcom that's vaguely sort of about it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on all of that. And kind of bringing this full circle with the slot run, I think it's interesting that like the personas were flipped in who's really doing the law practice stuff,
Mm-hmm.
because in the comic, She-Hulk is like the partier,
Mm-hmm.
and Jen Walters is the more serious persona, and Jen Walters is put in the position of being the face of GLK and H.
Mm-hmm.
And here it's the flip, right? Like Jen Walters seems the more kind of free spirit, and She-Hulk kind of has to be this lawyer in the position of representing this law firm. And so I can understand the desire to flip that, especially if you were going after this scene in this episode, which is to say She-Hulk is how she presents herself to the world, and Jen Walters is kind of who she wishes she could be. And in regards to fleshing that out, like this is kind of why I feel like if they ignored the lawyer stuff and really focused it on her having this schism of personality and celebrity versus, her private life, which they also try to do. Like there's a really weird scene, I think in like episode 2, where she goes to this bar and everybody in the bar is like, yeah, She-Hulk is here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how cool. And then it cuts and no one seems to care about her being there at all. Like they're just kind of ignoring her. Like, and she's sitting at a table talking to her friend without like people swarming her. And it's like, okay, I don't really know. Like they're kind of trying to do it both ways. But if the show was truly like just about that, I think they like this episode could have been a really strong turning point in a kind of more character-oriented, celebrity-interested series that I think is trying to do just like 5 or 6 too many things at once.
Yeah.
I've often complained about the show that it feels like comics used to be 28 pages in length on average, and now they're 21 pages in length on average, and those 7 missing pages is often like, it's crucial between a good book and a bad book. You can do a lot in like a quarter of the book being removed. And a lot of these episodes feel like that. Like, give me like 10 more minutes to really flesh this out and make it really sing. But that would squeeze past half an hour. But that's why I think this was one of the stronger episodes for me, because it just didn't have the other stuff. It just kind of focused on this one idea. And, you know, I thought it was stronger for it. And so we get the end of the episode with a shout out to what we'd be talking about today. On the side of the truck, it says Slot Towing, in reference to Dan Slott. And I thought, oh, I saw that. And I was like, Siddhant and Adlaka and I are going to be talking about this. So cool. We got a little Easter egg. Do you have any final thoughts on this episode before we kind of wrap things up?
I agree with what you said, in that it because it gives the Jen/She-Hulk side of things more focus away from all the lawyer activities, and there's no B plot. It feels a tad more substantial than some of the previous weeks, and also in the process, even without 3 days earlier thing, even without that segment, it feels like a complete episode. It feels like an episode with an actual ending. And gosh, that is such a low bar, because the last few weeks, the episodes have just felt like they've kind of just like ended out of nowhere at like just a completely random point.
Yeah.
Whereas there's like an actual, there's like a flow to it. There's a story to it, whether or not it works. It's about like, okay, she's riding this high and then she's down low and then she, finds a way to like build herself up again. And it's just like, all right, she's, driving back to civilization with sort of a new perspective. That's nice. And, the 3 days earlier thing is this nice little tease. So again, it feels like a complete episode. Congratulations to She-Hulk.
Yeah, it's so weird, because these Marvel shows seem to oscillate between like they're just never really sure what the product should be. Like Moon Knight should have been a movie. Like, it just should have been a movie. Maybe Falcon and Winter Soldier, a movie. Like, they don't have enough there to sustain a run. And this feels like they have too much stuff that they need to fit in, and the episodes need to be longer. And I guess short of like WandaVision and Miss Marvel, they haven't really figured out what these shows are yet, and you'd think they have a lot to trade from. They brought in Zeb Wells to write this episode, and like I said, he's a comic book writer. You've got Marvel has this whole history of short comic book writing, like for sequential stuff. TV should feel like the natural environment for Marvel to have media in, and yet like the movies still feel like where they should be, or what they figured out. And maybe that's just part of the growing process. But I would actually tell them, like, bring in more comic writers. They might be able to figure this out.
No, like a big problem with like how Marvel Studios does things is that it basically feels like they are shooting a first draft, but also that first draft hasn't been complete yet. And then they fix things, in reshoots and in post, and they, notoriously don't know what they want going in. So regardless of the level of skill and artistry of, the people involved on the writing and directing and production design side, you have this, this executive level that's like, do this, now we get this person to fix it, now we'll get that person to fix it. And, look how simply, just earlier this week, they turned what was supposed to be a TV series, Armor Wars, into a movie. It's like, all right, so the plan was to make something that I guess could have been either one. And hey, I'm not going to complain about a Marvel series being turned into a movie, because it, like you said, it feels like a lot of these should have been movies. But it makes you wonder, like, because the show was announced ages ago, so it's like, what were they like? What was the plan there? I'd love to get some behind the scenes dirt on that. Like, what were they doing? What made them decide this? What was the material they were working with that could have made them so easily go from, presumably a 6-part series to a feature film? And that makes me then wonder, like, how are they doing it with She-Hulk? Because She-Hulk, on the other hand, is very episodic, but also, like you said, it feels both insubstantial and overstuffed, in that there are all of these ideas. There's a lot going on. There's a lot in the margins but not all of it makes it into the place that it should. So it's incredibly messy in the process. But at the very end of this episode, it's like, all right, it gives us like a neat emotional resolution, and then gives us this little tease of like, oh, Josh bad, I guess. So yeah, I don't have much more to say that I haven't already said about this.
Well, great. Well, let's lay it to rest there and talk about what we're going to be doing next week. And Siddhant, I'm really excited to talk to you next week about the Charles Soule run of She-Hulk, which is the run that that came after Dan Slott's run many years later. But it sees She-Hulk opening her own law firm in her very own distinct way. And the most interesting thing about it, if I could entice people to read along with us, is that at the time, Charles Soule was a practicing lawyer who was writing comics at night. And so if you really like the lawyer element of She-Hulk, this one really pulls from reality in a way that I think makes this run really fun to read. It's short. It's 12 issues. We're going to be talking about the first 6. And I'm just excited to introduce you to it because I think it's really fun. And also Charles Soule would then later go on to write Daredevil for much longer and do the same thing, bring his experience from the law into the pages of Daredevil. So, hey, maybe we'll get a Daredevil cameo next week and it will really all sing. And we can pretend we did it intentionally. How does that sound?
It sounds great to me.
Awesome. Well, that'll do it for us today on Decoding TV, covering She-Hulk Attorney at Law Season 1, Episode 7. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to find more episodes of this podcast, go to podcast.decodingtv.com, where we're also covering Andor and The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, until David decides to take on a half dozen other shows. You can email us at decodingtv@gmail.com. And if you want to support the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. We'd really appreciate it. It's how Siddhant and I get to keep being a part of this platform. Next week, I'll be back filling in for David again. But until then, I'm Dan Gavosden, and that's Siddhant Adlaga for Decoding TV, and we'll see you later.
Hey everyone, David Chen here. Thank you so much for watching that video from Decoding TV. If you want to get an audio version of the show, all you got to do is go to podcast.decodingtv.com. And if you want to support what we do, get ad-free episodes of the podcast and also bonus episodes of the podcast, go to decodingtv.com and become a paid member. Of course, you can also like and subscribe for more. We appreciate it. Thanks. See you later.